Samuel Huntington first published an article called The Clash of Civilizations in the Journal of Foreign Affairs in 1993. It incited more debate than any piece of writing that has been seen since George Kennan's X article in the 1940s. In response, Huntington has now expanded his treatise into a book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. He asserts that in the coming decades, the world will divide not along political lines, but cultural lines. The thriving Muslim and East Asian societies will challenge Western dominance, and the United States, used to being a world leader, will need to reevaluate its policies on foreign intervention and domestic immigration in order to remain a major player. I am pleased to have the author of these provocative ideas on this broadcast this evening, because as many people who watch this show know, many people are suggesting that over the next 4 years there will be important tests of how the world is shaping up as we enter the next millennium, and as this administration looks for its own effort to leave its impact, may very well find that in the foreign policy arena. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
I want to just explore this through your words, the ideas that you set forth. Tell me what you are saying here and how the world is now different after the Cold War, and what forces are at work, and what ought we recognize, and what the United States has to do.
Well, that might require quite a long speech, but during the Cold War, as we know, the world was divided into three parts, basically. The free world led by the United States, the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union, and the more or less non-aligned third world, where much of the conflict between the other two worlds took place. That pattern of history has disappeared. And the big question is what will be the patterns of association and of conflict among nations in the post-Cold War world. And if one looks at the evidence, it seems to me that it is overwhelming that nations are going to be aligning themselves along cultural lines, that those countries with similar cultures are coming together. Those countries which historically have been culturally different are often coming apart. We've seen the breakup of both the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia along cultural lines, basically. And the lines of conflict will, in this post-Cold War world, will basically fall along the fault lines between the world's biggest cultural entities, which are civilizations.
Okay, name those for me.
Okay, the civilizations are, first of all, obviously the West, consisting of North America and Western Europe primarily, Islam as a civilization, Orthodox civilization, of which Russia is the leading state, of course, Chinese or Sinic civilization, Hindu civilization, in which India is the major state. Most people would classify Japan as a separate civilization all by itself. And then I would also add Latin America and Africa.
You would add those. It's about 7 or 8, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
All right. So the United States, the argument is made,
yes,
best recognize this in its own interest. That's first. That this is the way the new world is shaping up.
This is the way in which it seems to be shaping.
Whatever we said about a new world order,
yeah,
it hasn't evolved the way we thought it might be.
Well, certainly the euphoria which existed in 1989 after the Berlin Wall came down has disappeared, and I think there were great hopes at that time that we were entering a new world order, that this is going to be a world in which Western ideas of liberal democracy and capitalism would sweep across the world, and that a new era of harmony would emerge. Well, that hasn't happened. And history hasn't ended. It's in many respects been renewed in a very dramatic and often rather brutal fashion.
You're using another author's notion.
Oh,
it
that's
is
right.
that Fukuyama said that history had ended because the West had won the great battle.
That's right.
And there was
the ideological battle.
The ideological battle, and there was nothing else to do. Therefore, history was over.
Basically, that was what Frank Fukuyama was saying. Yeah.
And he, in reviewing your book in the Wall Street Journal, took issue with, obviously, I mean, there is a great...
That's right.
You say also the United States has to wake up in the next millennium and do several things. One, make partnership with Europe.
Yes.
2, limit immigration. Limit
yes,
immigration.
limit, not
legal
stop.
immigration.
Yes.
Restrict.
Well, reduce immigration for a period of time. I would very much support the recommendations of the Commission on Immigration that reported a couple of years ago that was chaired by the late Barbara Jordan, who urged a reduction in legal immigration from something over 800,000 down to something like 500 or 600,000. It seems to me we've had so many immigrants coming into this country since the laws were changed in 1965 that we've arrived at a point where we should pause and concentrate upon assimilating these millions of new immigrants who have come in.
Several criticisms
Yes.
have been made, and you've heard most of them, but let me go
Indeed.
after them.
Okay.
One is that those parties that react to, I mean, you look at what's happening in the Islamic Revolution, you say it's driven by a kind of cultural and civilizing force, a civilization force. B, there are others, though, would say that most of the states that you suggest are in one camp or the other are simply acting out of national interest in the way that nation states have always acted.
Well, that's absolutely true. Nation states have always acted out of national interest and will continue to do so. The important question is, how do they define their national interests? And what my argument is, that they are defining their national interests now increasingly in cultural terms and seeing those countries which have very different cultures, often as threats to themselves, and aligning themselves with countries with similar cultures. Look at what's happened in the Balkans, which was divided during the Cold War with Bulgaria and Romania in the Warsaw Pact, Greece and Turkey in NATO, Yugoslavia non-aligned, and Albania off by itself, an occasional friend of Communist China. But what has happened now? Yugoslavia is broken up. Serbia, and along with Bulgaria and Greece, have formed what they describe as an Orthodox Entente. The Catholic parts of Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and Croatia are knocking on the door to get into Western European institutions. Turkey is resuming its role as the protector of the Muslims in the Balkans, in Bosnia and in Albania. Greece and Turkey are allies in NATO. And of course, they were allies in NATO because they saw a common threat from the Soviet Union. Now that that threat is gone, are more teetering on the brink of violence against each other.
In your judgment, Yugoslavia split up along cultural lines.
Right.
Others will argue that it was not cultural or even religious lines, that it was, in fact, driven by nationalistic lines. Well, those were the forces that
were. You can put any label you want on them. The fact of the matter is that Yugoslavia divided up along lines which were, you can call nationalist, you can, or religious or civilizational, but it was basically Orthodox Serbs and Catholic
Croats.
Supported by Russians. Catholic Croats, supported by several of the Catholic countries of Western Europe.
And Muslim Bosnia supported by Judeo-Christian United States.
Exactly, which, as I point out in the book, was the anomaly. But as we now know, it wasn't the United States that provided most of the help to the Bosnian Muslims.
It was the Iranians.
It was the Muslim world generally. It was the Bosnian Muslims became a very popular cause throughout the Muslim world, and it was the Iranians, the Saudi Arabians, Turkey, Malaysia, other countries which furnished arms and poured in hundreds of millions of dollars, probably close to $2 billion to support the Bosnian Muslims.
You also make, tell me how you look at the idea of sort of Western culture as a vehicle or as a reflection of the triumph of the Western model.
Well, I don't know that I exactly look at it that way. I think Western culture is quite unique, and one can trace the emergence of the central elements of Western culture and civilization back 1,000 years. And they have made the West quite different from most other civilizations in terms of our concepts of the rule of law, separation of church and state, rights of the individuals, the pluralistic nature of Western society historically is quite unique, and that makes Western culture very different. And I think it is the reason why 500 years or so ago, the West took the initiative in modernizing the world and in conquering a good part of the world in the process. And other civilizations are now trying to catch up, and of course the East Asian civilizations are well on the way there.
And Western modernization...
Well, I think one has to draw a distinction between what is modern and what is Western.
What's the distinction?
Well, all peoples virtually wish to become modern. They want to be wealthy, they want to have modern technology, modern science, all the benefits of the existence of existence in the modern world. But that doesn't necessarily mean they want to import Western culture. In fact, in most of these other societies and civilizations, they very explicitly don't want to. Now, whether they can separate the two all that well is uncertain. They are certainly, however, making great efforts to do so. And of course, we have countries such as Japan, which are thoroughly modern, but I don't think anybody would call Japan Western.
But it has adapted much of the Western culture, and the Western culture is a predominant part of, is a significant part of that the economic base, isn't it?
Well, Japan, I would say Japan is modernizing, and in the process...
Has accepted...
Sure, it's imported elements of Western culture, but it's hard for me to think of Japan as being Western. And I don't think the Japanese think of Japan as being Western. They recognize the very fundamental differences between their society and culture and way of life and that which exists here in the United States.
Do you think those that look at the power of global capitalism overemphasize its impact in terms of its impact on the world? For example, as you know, Tom Friedman wrote an interesting piece, partly tongue-in-cheek, in which he said there are no two countries which have a McDonald's franchise that have ever fought a war against each other. Well, suggesting the notion, he said tongue-in-cheek, that in fact having a McDonald's franchise represents a certain level of economic development.
Well, it may. Whether it represents a certain level of cultural development is another question.
And having a McDonald's franchise may very well be a source of some antagonism within cultural elements within a nation state.
But I guess I don't think we want to equate Western culture with fatty foods or fizzy drinks or faded pants, and that's what people tend to do. They say, look at all these
or Schwarzenegger movies or whatever.
Exactly, but that's superficial. It doesn't really get to the heart of a society, and when one looks at other civilizations, one has to remember that Chinese civilization has existed for thousands of years, and so has Hindu civilization, and Japanese civilization, and Muslim civilization for 1,300 years. These aren't phenomena that are going to disappear.
Where do you think we're more likely to have a clash? I mean, I've had people on this program say that they concern themselves about a coming conflict that might exist between Japan and China in competition over Asia.
Well, I think that if Chinese economic development continues for another decade or so at the same rate that it has for the past 2 decades, China will become increasingly assertive and will increasingly want to reestablish its position as the hegemonic power in East Asia. Which
hegemony over Japan and South Korea and
hegemony
Indonesia.
Meaning not that it's going to conquer them or invade them.
But it means sphere of influence.
It means a sphere of influence, and it will. And this historically was what existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years down until the middle of the 19th century. And the Chinese feel that that is their right. And you talk to them, they will say, we want to reestablish that.
And does
position.
the author of The Clash of Civilization and the Remaking of World Order believe that that will happen?
Well, as I
take
said,
note of the assertiveness.
Right.
Do you believe the assertiveness will lead to a Chinese hegemony in that area?
Yes. Now, but on the assumption that the economic development of China continues, on the assumption that China remains a unified entity, which I think is very likely, then I think China will reassert its hegemony. And you mentioned Japan. A key question is how will Japan react to this? An even more important question is how will the United States react to it?
And what can you contribute to that idea, that question, how the United States will react to it?
Well, historically, we have always opposed the domination of either Europe or East Asia by any single power. And in this century, we have fought 2 world wars and 1 Cold War in order to prevent any single power dominating those parts of the world. And the big question is, are we ready to confront China?
Well, Richard Bernstein, who gave you a good review in the New York Times, essentially has a book coming out along with Mr. Monroe, in which he says the title is The Coming War with China.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily coming, but I think it's going to pose a major problem for the United States.
There is also the assertiveness that you take note of, I think, I mean, I may be reading your book wrong, of Islamic civilization in its own area.
Peoples, yes.
Islamic peoples, whether both in the Middle East and, and in the Aegean area.
Yes, yes. Right.
And is that likely to lead to a conflict in which the United States cannot stay out of?
Well, I don't think it's likely to lead to any major conflict. One of the distinctive characteristics of Islam as a civilization today is that there is no single dominant core Islamic state. Islam is very divided. Muslims are fighting themselves. They also are fighting most of their neighbors off and on. And
well, doesn't that erode your theory?
What?
That there's conflict within the Islamic community?
No,
and that there is no...
It's a refinement to my theory, because if you look at the political evolution of civilizations, and scores of scholars have done this, and they've come up with a model which suggests that civilizations evolve through phases, warring states phases, times of troubles, and then a universal state for the civilization emerges, and this process may be repeated. And Islam had something like a dominant universal state with the Ottoman Empire, which disappeared, and it is now in a warring states phase.
Yes. Everybody says this is a provocative book. I mean, and everybody, whether they agree with everything, always say it's an important contribution to make people think about the way the world is reshaping itself.
Hope so, yeah.
Well, they do. I mean, you know that better than I do. I mean, from Kissinger and other people who think about these issues a lot, and people at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a lot of other people in academic environments. They all, many of them, because the thesis is so large, suggest that there are places in which you had to move, you had to make a very tight squeeze to make facts fit your theory. They will say, for example, that there are a number of countries of, let's say, within the Islamic world, which have nothing in common.
Oh, well, sure. I mean,
and you can't make an argument that they...
Well, well, first of all, Islam, as I said, is very divided.
Right.
And there are sub-civilizations within Islam, Arabic, Malay, Turkic, etc. And there is a competition going on for leadership in Islam. And this is one of the destabilizing forces at work today. You mentioned earlier that Iran and Saudi Arabia were furnishing arms and support to the Bosnian Muslims. They were competing with each other doing that because they're trying to assert themselves as leaders of Islam. And those 2 countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, have furnished support to many other Muslim groups fighting non-Muslims.
You also say it's United States should not get involved in the question of human rights as a part of its trade policy with respect to China. There seems to be the United States ought to keep, I'm using layman's language, keep its nose out of other nations' business.
Well, I believe that the United States should do what it can to promote our values of human rights and democracy. I think we have to recognize that there are great resistances, obstacles to doing this in many parts of the world, both cultural obstacles and economic obstacles. During the past 20 years, close to 40 countries in the world have shifted from some form of authoritarian rule to some form of democratic rule. most of those countries are countries which have either Western culture or have been heavily influenced by the West. Now, I am not arguing that a country has to be Western to be democratic. India and Japan are two notable examples. That's not the case. All I'm saying is that in some non-Western cultures, and Islam and Confucian culture are the usual examples, there's great resistance to accepting Western values of human rights and democracy because these countries come from totally different cultural traditions.
Are you saying to all Americans and all Western Europeans, wake up, your time is over? The influence of the West is only going to decline in the future.
I think the influence of the West has been declining for some while now during the current century, and it will continue to decline because other nations are modernizing and developing and are acquiring economic wealth and power, and after that will come military power and political influence. And this is, of course, as I said, most notable with respect to East Asian societies. If I may, there was this a wonderful meeting last year of the heads of government from Western Europe and from East Asia in Bangkok, right. In which Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia got up and told Kohl and Chirac and Major and their colleagues, and I quote him now, European values are European values, Asian values are universal values. That was turning the tables on the West, which loves to think of its values
as universal.
As universal, yes.
It's a provocative and interesting book. Samuel Huntington of Harvard University, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is a book people are talking about, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. Samuel P. Huntington from Harvard University. We'll be right back. John Cleese is here and also Lauren Bacall. Stay with us.